If you constantly feel short on money, you probably blame yourself first. You assume you lack discipline, impulse control, or long-term thinking. But what if the real risk isn't your behavior, but the system you are operating inside? You work 40 hours a week, sometimes more, trading time for stability. Your salary increases slowly, yet your financial drawdown feels constant. The effort compounds, but your breathing room never does. A $5 coffee triggers more guilt than a $500 fixed expense. A short trip feels irresponsible, even if your time horizon is long-term. Yet the volatility in your budget rarely comes from small pleasures. Most of your income never pauses in your account long enough to feel secure. It moves automatically toward rent, loans, insurance, and other fixed commitments. Before you can think about compounding, the base layer is already claimed. This channel is not about motivation or promises of overnight wealth. It is about understanding the long-term math behind income, costs, and risk exposure. And today, you may realize the problem was structural, not personal. The popular narrative is simple. If money feels tight, you must be spending carelessly. The advice sounds logical, but it rarely changes your long-term financial trajectory. You downloaded the budgeting app. You built the spreadsheet and tracked every dollar. Yet the margin at the end of the month still feels thin. You cut dining out, you canceled subscriptions, but rent keeps rising and premiums adjust without asking for permission. There is a difference between variable spending and fixed obligations. One adjusts with discipline. The other defines your risk exposure before you even begin the month. In many major U.S. cities, rent alone can absorb 30 to 40% of net income. Add health insurance and transportation. Before you live, you are already covering survival costs with almost no flexibility in your time horizon. The issue is not a $6 latte. The issue is thousands automatically committed each month. That silent automation shapes your long-term compounding more than small daily treats. We are trained to feel guilty about the visible small things. Meanwhile, the structural costs remain unquestioned. That framing protects the system from scrutiny, not your balance sheet from volatility. When you blame yourself, you stop examining the structure. Structure defines optionality and your ability to absorb drawdown. Context does not remove responsibility, but it changes the analysis. If you feel exhausted chasing numbers that never feel enough, that response is rational. You are running on a track while carrying fixed costs on your back, and that weight quietly limits your long-term margin. Let's look at a simple model. Income comes in. Then it gets immediately absorbed by fixed costs before you even feel it. Rent or a mortgage takes the largest share. Health insurance quietly pulls from your time horizon. Car loans and student debt sit there every month, unaffected by volatility. Utilities and internet quietly extend the list. Childcare adds another fixed layer for young families. These numbers are not flexible experiments. They are commitments. Only after everything is paid does the remainder appear. That remainder is what you actually live on. It is not for compounding wealth, just for staying afloat long-term. When 60 to 70% is locked, your margin shrinks. Small price changes feel like drawdowns. Minor risk events suddenly feel personal. This is what I call the fixed cost trap, not because escape is impossible, but because awareness is rare. It feels normal since everyone around you lives the same structure. When margin is thin, stress increases. Under stress, financial decisions shorten their time horizon. Then you blame yourself for reacting to volatility. But this is simple math, not a character flaw. High fixed costs reduce optionality. Reduced optionality makes life feel narrow. This is not about discipline, it is about cost structure. And structures can be examined calmly without panic. Productivity culture celebrates individual discipline as if outcomes are purely personal. It suggests that success is just a function of effort and time horizon. That sounds heroic, but it ignores systemic risk and volatility. We rarely talk about rising living costs adjusting faster than wages. We rarely talk about real income stagnation over the long term. Instead, the conversation keeps circling back to mindset. Mindset matters, but it does not cancel math. Waking up earlier does not change fixed expenses or drawdown risk. Sometimes the issue lives in the numbers, not in the alarm clock. When you feel behind, you assume you lack hustle, but you might simply be living in a high-cost city with compressed margins. Context shapes outcomes more than motivational quotes admit. Guilt is a powerful compliance tool. It keeps you focused on self-blame instead of structural risk. That is efficient for the system, but exhausting over time. Overspending is a simple story. Fixed costs, debt structures, and long-term obligations are more complex. The brain prefers simple narratives over layered financial reality. Simple stories shrink the solution to cutting coffee, but the largest financial shifts happen in housing, transportation, and career volatility. Big variables matter more than small daily habits over a long time horizon. You are not broken. You are operating on a board with expensive rules and tighter margins. Different environments require different strategies and risk awareness. This awareness is not about blaming the economy. It is about reducing unnecessary self-blame and understanding long-term positioning. Clarity is the first step toward rational financial decisions. If fixed costs are the real pressure, the strategy has to shift. Cutting coffee helps, but it barely moves the long-term equation. The bigger risk usually sits inside the structure of your life. Ask whether your rent matches your income and time horizon. Ask whether your car is a necessity or just urban habit. Ask whether remote work could quietly reduce your exposure to volatility. Big decisions rarely feel comfortable at first, but they influence compounding outcomes more than small daily sacrifices. One structural shift can replace hundreds of minor cuts. It might mean relocating to a more affordable area. It might mean sharing space longer than expected. It might mean delaying lifestyle upgrades until your margin stabilizes. This is not extreme minimalism. It is about buying breathing room in your budget. That breathing room is called margin. Margin gives you time to think beyond the next paycheck. Margin reduces the emotional drawdown during crisis. Margin increases your ability to take measured risk with a longer time horizon. Without margin, every month feels like an emergency. With margin, the future becomes visible again. Sometimes the difference is only a few $100s redirected with intention. Increasing income still matters in the long-term equation. But without fixed cost control, raises get absorbed by lifestyle inflation and volatility. That pattern explains why many professionals feel stuck despite growth. Strategy is not about punishment. Strategy is about moving the largest numbers in your personal balance sheet. And the largest numbers usually live inside fixed costs. Let's bring this down to real numbers. Imagine taking home $5,000 a month after tax. On paper, that feels responsible and stable. Now subtract $2,000 for rent, $500 for health insurance, $400 for a car payment that gets you to work. Add utilities, internet, and basic groceries. Add gas and the small unpredictable expenses that always appear. The $5,000 starts quietly shrinking. Without noticing, more than $3,000 is already committed. That's before saving anything. That's before enjoying your time horizon. The remaining $1,000 to $1,500 sounds manageable. But this is where savings, entertainment, and emergencies compete. The margin is thinner than it looks. Now imagine a small price increase, or a sudden car repair during market volatility. A thin margin quickly feels fragile. This is why 70% can feel invisible. It isn't stolen or wasted. It's absorbed by fixed structures with long-term commitments. When you see the math clearly, guilt changes shape. It stops being about discipline. It becomes about proportion and structural risk. And proportion can be evaluated calmly, not with panic about short-term drawdown, but with rational strategy and long-term thinking. In my view, the biggest issue of this generation is not laziness. Most people are working longer hours with shorter time horizons. The real shift is that personal financial margin keeps shrinking quietly. Salaries have increased on paper over time, but in many major cities, living costs rise faster than income growth and increase volatility in monthly budgeting. That gap shows up quietly in every paycheck cycle. We live in an era of high fixed expenses. Long contracts, long loans, and long-term commitments define adulthood now. Flexibility becomes shorter even as obligations stretch further into the future. Modern systems encourage ownership early. A house, a car, and lifestyle upgrades are framed as progress within a short time horizon. Each one quietly adds long-term risk and recurring payments. When everyone carries similar financial weight, it feels normal. Normal, however, does not automatically mean sustainable over the long term. Sometimes it is just collective exposure to the same drawdown risk. I'm not saying the system is entirely broken. I am also not saying individuals have no responsibility in managing risk. The reality is that both forces interact over a long-term compounding cycle. If you only blame yourself, you internalize every setback as personal failure. If you only blame the system, you reduce your perceived control over volatility. Balance begins with clear analysis instead of emotional reaction. Analysis gives you clarity about your true time horizon. Clarity improves your response to risk and reduces unnecessary volatility in decisions. That is where optionality quietly begins. Most people are not chasing luxury. They are chasing stable breathing room in their monthly numbers. What they really want is a sustainable margin that survives long-term uncertainty. The first step is not cutting coffee or small subscriptions. The first step is calculating how much of your income is locked into fixed costs. Write the number down honestly because math is calmer than assumptions. If your fixed costs are above 60%, your flexibility starts shrinking. Above 70%, your time horizon becomes fragile during volatility. Above 80%, even a small drawdown feels personal. Housing is often the largest line in your budget. Ask whether it supports your long-term stability or just your image. Risk is not always in markets, sometimes it is in rent. Transportation should function as a tool, not a signal. A car with high monthly payments reduces your compounding capacity quietly. Symbols rarely improve long-term margin. Review your debt without emotion. Consumer debt limits flexibility and increases stress during volatility. Even productive debt should be measured against risk and time horizon. Money decisions affect more than one person. Talking openly with your partner reduces hidden risk. Transparency often increases stability more than income does. An emergency fund is not about looking financially smart. It reduces emotional drawdown when uncertainty appears. Calm minds make better long-term decisions. A small margin is more powerful than the illusion of wealth. Margin gives you time when markets fluctuate. Time allows compounding to work quietly. This shift will not happen overnight. It is a gradual repositioning of your financial structure. Repositioning quietly reduces regret in the long term. If after all this you feel slightly relieved, that makes sense. Maybe this is the first time you're seeing the full structure instead of blaming your own habits. When the math becomes visible, the anxiety feels less personal and more systemic. You are not reckless with money. You are operating inside a heavy cost structure shaped by housing, debt, and volatility. And structures can be analyzed instead of internalized as shame. When you stop attacking yourself, your energy returns. That energy can be redirected toward improving your margin and adjusting your time horizon. Bigger decisions require clarity, not self-criticism. Margin is not about becoming wealthy overnight. It is about creating breathing room so volatility and drawdown do not control your decisions. That kind of stability compounds quietly over the long term. If this perspective helped you see the risk differently, stay with us. We will continue breaking down the uncomfortable math behind modern life without hype or promises. We don't shout here, we calculate.